Thank you very much for choosing to join us at The Devil is in the Details, how to optimize Magento hosting to increase your online sales. My name's Will Bernstein. I'm Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing at ZeroLag, and we are a Platinum Magento hosting partner. So we have a ton of ground to cover today in a fairly short period of time, so we're going to do the best we can to get it all in. We've got a case study to share with you. Then we've got some very interesting load testing results. We're going to jump into best practices for optimizing Magento. And then we're going to make the all-important link from performance to conversions. So we're going to start with a case study. And we call it the mystery of the locked database. And it stars one of our clients, Zarpo.com. And Zarpo is the first and largest flash sale travel website in Latin America. Now, they're based in Brazil, and they are running a highly customized deployment of Magento Enterprise Edition. On Monday, January 13th, 2014, they had a catastrophic event. At 12:37 p.m., they opened a critical ticket with our support team. Zarpo is badly down. At 12:48, our team completed their analysis, and it was a MySQL crash due to extremely high volumes of queries that ended up locking up the database. So our team killed all the queries. They were able to restart SQL, and we got the website back up and running and ready for business. But at 1:22, we knew we were in deep trouble because these queries continued to pile up, and we had no idea why. So we had to solve it. We put a crack team together to solve the mystery. Meet Dominic Baines, Senior DBA, and Sean McManus, Senior Magento Systems Administrator. Now keep your eye on that guy. So they dig in. At 5 o'clock, they do database diagnostics and configuration analysis. And by 6:18, they have a primary suspect. They set up a test environment to focus on database cache under load. Now, they work all night on this, and I'm going to spare you all the gory details, but by the next morning, the mystery was solved. Now, what they found is an AJAX call that checks a custom cache. Now, this AJAX call fires each time a user logs into Zarpo and loads up travel deals. Now, what you also need to understand is that every time a travel deal is either sold or updated, that same custom cache gets cleared, and the next AJAX call kicks off a recache. So here's where there's the fatal flaw. And some people are shaking their heads like they, I think, are a little ahead of the curve here. But what happens is that if a cache has not been built by the time the next AJAX call happens, another cache gets launched. So this was not a problem until, unbeknownst to us, Zarpo released their mobile application, and usage increased 800%. And that's when we had this massive cache rebuild logjam on our hands. So we got to fix it. And this is where things can get very dicey between developer and hosting company. Unfortunately, hosting companies have been known to throw developers under the bus. So at ZeroLag, we do not throw developers under the bus. Instead, we pick them up and we solve the problem together. Now, in this particular case, Sean McManus, the guy I said you should keep your eye on, he'd actually already devised a very elegant solution. And it's AJAX code that blocks all rebuilds if a rebuild is already in progress. So he presents this to the developers. they give it the thumbs up, they implement it, and it works like magic. In fact, they name it the McManus Magic Shield. And a few days later, we get a Skype from the CEO of Zarpo. Excellent news. The McManus Magic Shield is on and working beautifully. This morning, I triggered this big event recast with over 550 concurrent users online, and site did not even move a little bit. So that's our case study. It also gave you some insight into how we work at Zero Lag. And what I'd like to do next is invite Cameron King. Cameron's our Linux manager, and he's going to introduce our load testing results to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will.
That's
all right. Not a problem. So today we're going to talk a little bit about load testing. And we're going to talk about the sort of load testing that everyone talks about first. Then we're going to move on to a less common type of load testing, more real-world type load testing. Now, when we get into that, why do we do load testing? We do load testing because it gives us visibility into a specific site environment and code combination, gives us visibility into both the performance and scalability of that environment. The reason why we need this information is because it informs us on how we can quote out different environment sizes. It gives information to the sales team to be used in the pre-sales process. It gives information to the support team in order to better diagnose issues. And it also allows customers and developers to vet their changes. Whenever a developer makes a significant change to their code, one of the things that we'll recommend is that perhaps you explore load testing. Let's take a before, let's take an after. Let's see if the change was beneficial or if perhaps it hurt you. Now, there's two different scales here. We talk about performance and we talk about scalability. Sometimes, in the interest of maximizing performance, you may accidentally lose some scalability. And by testing both, you're able to ensure that not only did you meet the goal you were aiming to meet, but you also didn't sacrifice something else inadvertently. So the first type of load test we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about laboratory load testing. This is the more academic side of load testing. This, as engineers, as sysadmins, this is what we love. We love to go in and answer the question, how fast can we make Magento go? That's really sexy. We love that. How fast can we make it go? And that's a great question. But that's not necessarily the question that we're trying to answer more often than not. What the real question is we're trying to answer is how fast can we make your website go? And in order to answer that question, we need 2 points of comparison. We need a baseline, which for this case, we're going to use our laboratory load testing as a baseline. And we also need to know a real-world example of how your website performs. When we compare your website with the baseline, then we can take that and we can pull some really interesting information out of it, and we can look to answer the question of why is your website performing slower or faster than the baseline? What are the causes that contribute to that? And we can get to some very cool stuff. So for our laboratory load testing, this is for the purpose of creating our baseline. We use a community favorite tool, Gatling. We test with stock Magento EE 1.13.01 with sample data provided by Magento, and we also use a custom script that allows us to generate various store sizes between 1,000 and 500,000 products. We also test it with traffic levels of between 100 and 500 concurrent visitors to the site. We find that this is a representative sample of what a typical Magento store might see. Obviously, some sites are smaller, some sites are bigger, but this is a good starting point for the purposes of creating a baseline to answer that question of why does your site perform faster or slower than the baseline. We also only consider load tests to be valid if they have a 99% or better success rate. If you have a high failure rate as a result of your load testing, all you're testing is how fast can you serve error pages. That is not interesting to me. What I want to know is how fast can your site work, not how fast can it fail. So we only consider tests results that have 99% or higher success rates. Now let's take a look at some of the data. In this chart, we're looking at two different tiers of data, or two different tiers of environments. These are two of our more popular combinations. They're sort of entry-level combinations, and most any Magento store may be looking to consider one of these two options. Obviously, there's bigger, obviously, there's smaller, but again, we're looking for a typical baseline here. In this first test, we have a single web server and a single database server, and they're joined together in one environment. You see pretty typical results. On the y-axis, you've got milliseconds of response time, lower is better, and on the x-axis, you have number of concurrent visitors, between 100 and 500 concurrent visitors. Nobody in the room is going to be surprised by this graph. When there's not as many visitors on the site is faster. Okay, we get that. The interesting thing is when you compare two data points. Our second data point is that we've got a dual web server with a single database server at the end. Now, any sysadmin will tell you is that when you start to get to the higher levels of concurrency, having more processors is a benefit. In this case, we've got two web servers, so you've got twice as many sockets. And when we get up to the 400 and 500 levels of concurrency, it means that the blue line, the larger environment, is able to handle that traffic better, while the single server environment continues to get slower. The larger environment levels off and it hits its stride. My wife is a runner. She'll tell you that once you can hit your stride, you can handle anything. And so this larger environment really hits its stride at the 400 and 500 level. Once we start getting more and more and more and more and more, then you may look at adding a third web server. You may look at some other optimizations as well. But some people may be curious about what's happening on the left side of the graph. And let's take a closer look at that. On the left side of the graph, we've got the slower environment, or the smaller environment outperforming the larger environment. Why is that the case? Why would a single web server be faster than a cluster? And it all depends on the bottlenecks. In this particular case, at very low traffic levels, your CPU is not your bottleneck. It's not strained. That means that the extra benefit of having a second web server, twice as many sockets, you're not really yielding the benefits there because you're not CPU limited to begin with. But then why aren't they exactly the same? And that has to do with when you move to a cluster, you start to network some of your services that might have previously lived on a single host. In this case, in our standard configuration, we have shared PHP sessions over Memcache and a shared file system. We do a shared file system because it is much easier on the developers at that point. It means the developer doesn't have to keep his code in sync across multiple sites, and the shared PHP sessions allows us to continue to share the shopping cart between multiple web servers in case the customer hits that 8-hour timeout and they accidentally switch from one load balancer to another or something like that. We don't have to worry about losing shopping cart data when you bounce web servers. And we see about a 50 millisecond slowdown whenever you move to a cluster configuration. Now, 50 milliseconds in exchange for HA between your web servers, me personally, I'll take that deal any day. But it does highlight the fact that environment sizing is important. And sometimes throwing an extra piece of hardware into the mix isn't always the right answer. And so we provide this data to our sales team, and in the pre-sales process, they're armed with this information, and they know this information, and they're aware that sizing is critical. In our next example, we're going to talk about cache configuration. This is Magento Fast Cache. Our two main ways that we do fast cache that we see customers do and that we recommend would be between either Memcache or Redis. Now, Redis is getting more and more support, in the Magento community, and that's great. Redis can do some really cool things that Memcache can't do. It supports tags, has the potential to be faster, but for the purposes of our baseline, in a stock configuration, what are the real performance differences between Memcache and Redis? And what we see is that Redis follows a very similar trend to what we saw in our environment load tests, and so does Memcache. Memcache and Redis in a stock configuration have almost no performance differences. Now, of course, the real performance differences for Redis are going to be when you start implementing these extra features, when you start using the Redis tags. And in those cases, you may start to see some interesting differences between Memcache and Redis, but it's not at the service level so much as it is at the feature level. And that's why it's so important to be well informed whenever you're making these types of decisions. And these are the sorts of things that we collaborate on with our developers. We take this knowledge, we share it with them. Ultimately, the developer can make that call whether they want to use Memcache or Redis, but we make sure that they make that call armed with all the best information we can provide. Now, this was our laboratory load test. This is for the purpose of creating a baseline. And what are some of the things that we saw in this laboratory load test? We saw that environment sizing is critical. We saw that stock Magento is fast and scalable when it's deployed with best practice. We see that Memcache and Redis have very similar performance profiles under load, and it gives us a baseline on which we can compare some real-world sites. We're going to take some questions at the end. Now, for our real-world load testing, we selected 5 representative Magento sites. These are 5 customers that represent big, they represent small, they have some development challenges, they have some fantastic development platforms. This is representative of all of our types of Magento customers. We followed the same basic load testing practices that we followed with our baseline, trying to keep everything as much the same as possible. And let's take a look at some of that data. This is our second data point. This is what we're going to compare against that baseline in order to tell a story. And what we've got here is we've got the customer response times compared against concurrent users. We've got 4 out of our 5 customers represented on this graph, and let's compare it with the baseline. What we see out of this chart is that of these 4 customers, 1 customer was slower than the baseline, while the other 3 were better than the baseline, 2 of them significantly so. So let's take a look at each of these customers one by one, and let's answer the question, why does this website perform worse or better than the baseline? It's in this process that we really start to get the interesting information that allows for Zero Lag and the developers to collaborate together and to create something interesting. The first customer we're going to look at is Orange. This is our customer that performed worse than the baseline. Now, why is that the case? Well, they have some points in their favor. They're using Enterprise Edition, and they've got full page cache enabled. But it's not being fully utilized. Why are they having some problems with full page cache? Well, they gutted the internal Magento templating system, and they replaced the whole thing with Expression Engine. What this means is that even though they've enabled full page cache, even though Magento out of the box has some great tools for managing cache and managing the front end, they're not getting the benefit of any of that because they made a very substantial change to their front end. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The website is working great for what they're using it for. The traffic levels they see, they're very happy with what they've got. And it allowed them to use Expression Engine, which is something that they were familiar with. But in making that decision, there's a trade-off involved. This is one of those cases where they were aiming for a certain set of features, they made a trade-off. And that's okay, it's a valid decision, but it's a great example of this type of exchange that takes place between Zero Lag and the developers. Let's take a look at our next customer. And all of these are going to perform better than the baseline. This particular customer only has a single web server. Single web server with a database on it. They have enabled a number of custom plugins, which initially really hurt them performance-wise. They had a very high number of plugins, and this caused some significant slowdowns. But when working with us, what we were able to do is we were to help them move to Varnish and using a third-party plugin in order to manage that varnish so that they could start to offset some of that performance loss that they experienced. So we were able to collaborate to sort of have a seesaw effect. They initially added some features which slowed things down, but then we applied some pressure on the other side. We were able to deploy some solutions to help them offset that. And this was a very productive exchange that happened there. The next customer we've got has a larger environment. It performs better than the baseline, and they perform significantly better than the baseline. Let's take a look at why. They, again, are using a front end specifically designed for Magento. They're using that Magento default theme as their starting point, and they're building on it, staying in sync with the way Magento is intended to be used. They're using full page cache, and they're using a local HTTP accelerator. Guys, we're talking about Varnish here, right? They're running Varnish on their local server, they're deploying best practice on their local server, and they're getting some really stellar results. Our fourth customer out of this batch, let's take a look at them. Now, they're getting very similar performance to the last customer that we talked about, but they have some amazing scalability. And here's the difference. Instead of using a local HTTP accelerator, they're doing all the same things as the other customer, but they're using a cloud-based HTTP accelerator. Using this type of CDN allows them to get all the same benefits of Varnish, but they get that scalability of using a cloud provider. The only hits that are going to their server are hits for logged in users making purchases. That's where the money is. The money is in the shopping cart activity. That's what you want to be spending your hard-earned money on. That's what you want your hardware to be processing. Everything else, non-logged in users, guys coming in off of Google, guys coming in off of search results, those are great. You want your site to be up. You want your site to be fast. But you want the cloud to handle that. You don't want to have to spend your local CPU resources handling that type of traffic. You want to save your local resources for the money-making hits. Now that's 4 customers. You heard me say 5. Why did I save this customer for their own slide? I saved this customer for their own slide because they wouldn't fit on the other slide. I said that these were representative. Well, one of customers had some very significant scalability challenges because of some design decisions that they made. And this, again, isn't a case where the developer is thrown under the bus. Rather, this is a case where we collaborate together in order to make lemonade out of lemons. And we work together and we get the site working and we make the customer happy. We give them the tools they need in order to be successful. Now, even with that, they were only able to get to 30 concurrent browsers with their particular site. And let's take a look at why, because this is a very interesting case. In this particular case, they're still using a CDN. They've got a web server with a database server behind it. The hardware's sound. They have a fantastic single user experience. Single user experience is that experience you get when you log into the website at midnight. You know, you're the only one there. Nobody else is on the site. You're just hitting it out of the blue. Maybe it's running on a local machine or something. But this site has the best single user experience out of any of the sites we tested, yet has very poor scalability. And here are some of the reasons why. They have a large number of complex plugins, and they have some significant development issues. In this particular case, you hire one developer who does some work. Maybe you're not happy with that work. You move on to the next developer. They go in, they fix some things, they put their own spin on it, but ultimately they're not successful in making the site do what you need it to do, so a third developer comes in, right? In this case, there's no unifying vision. It's very important that when you're working on a site, you're working with a company that can provide you that type of vision. We have some really great partners that we work with that can help provide that kind of full service and that kind of vision, and they can take your site from beginning to end and they can make it phenomenal. Unfortunately, this particular customer came to us with some of these development challenges, and it provided us with some things that we needed to really work around. Now, because of some of these challenges in their code, they are restricted to using only file-based Magento Fast Cache and DB-based PHP sessions. Now, I just saw someone in the back there, like shudder, right? DB-based PHP sessions. This is not where you want to be if you're aiming for performance and scalability, but they're using some custom code that requires it. And that means they're locked into this for as long as they're using their current code base. And this is a real challenge that we had to work around. On top of all that, probably the biggest killer for this customer is that full-page cache is incompatible with some of their plugins in code. I believe that this was actually coming out of the custom code, not necessarily the plugins, but in the end, they cannot use full-page cache on their site. So they're using file-based fast cache, DB-based PHP sessions, and full-page cache is not an option. That means they're extremely CPU intensive and they're CPU bound, and they're not going to be able to break away from that. They do not have a strong foundation in place in order to handle the load and the scalability that they need from this site. Now, fortunately, they don't get a whole lot of hits. They're profitable, they're enjoying their site, they're very happy with it. But if they were to do a Black Friday deal, if they were to do something Cyber Monday, they would just get murdered. And that's because they don't have this foundation in place. So what we see out of our real-world load test recap is we see that code quality is the single greatest factor in determining the performance of a Magento site. Now, this is coming from a hosting company, right? How many hosting companies have you heard say that if you want great performance and scalability in a Magento site, you're going to need to look to your developers first? Well, we understand that this is a collaboration. The developers provide the foundation on which everything is built. And if that foundation is strong, then we can take that foundation and we can build you whatever kind of house you want. You want a little cabin in the woods? That's great. You want a castle? We can do that. But it starts with a good foundation and some collaboration between the developers and the hosting company. And once we've got that strong foundation, we can use best practices like full-page cache, accelerators, clustering, in-memory cache. These are all great ways to improve performance and scalability, but it's a collaboration. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Doug Goldberg, who is our VP of Magento Solutions, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about best practices in Magento development.
Thanks, Cam. Give it up for Cam again. That was amazing. Seriously. When he came to me and told me what we were doing for our load test, I was ecstatic. How many saw that presentation and said, that's not the same load test I've seen a half a dozen times from every hosting company? Because I hadn't seen that before. And I hope none of you out had seen it before. It was very, very exciting. So what you're used to in load testing is a utopian view of Magento with, base install, no plugins, throw everything under the sun, put varnish on it, throw everything on there, throttle the heck out of it, and see how many transactions per second you come up with. That's not what we did. We created a baseline. We said, okay, here's some standard optimizations we do. Let's create the baseline. Let's use that. And then what we're going to do is look at real-world examples. How exciting was that? You saw how some people got better than baseline, and some had some challenges, and what those challenges were and what those bottlenecks were. It really excites me to see that, because it talks about how important it is to collaborate with your solution partner and your hosting company and the merchant, all sitting in the room and all getting on that bus together that Will was talking about. It's highly, highly important. And I have these conversations every single day. So it's very important to work with a solution partner that you know knows best practices. And the slides we're going to talk about here, they already know. But this is for the ones that maybe don't. So what are some of the common bottlenecks you're going to see? Poorly optimized front end is one of the big ones, right? Things like very large images. I have a client who called me and said, our homepage is slow. Well, it's 15 megabytes. That's large, guys. That's massive. These are things that could be bottlenecks for you. Hundreds of very small images. So there's not a bunch of big ones, but there's 1,000 of them, right? This will cause problems for you. Not combining JavaScript and CSS, another big bottleneck, right? JavaScript and CSS out of order. That's another one. JavaScript is a blocking script. You want that at the end. You want the eyes to look at something and see it first. That's the CSS. Do that first. Or you're not doing browser caching. This is another problem, another bottleneck that you could have. Or you're not using caching extensively. These are all very important. So what's the best practices? Some of the ones we just talked about. So reduce the number of calls. I got a call from a client. He says, it's taking 30 seconds to load my homepage. He's a bookseller. I said, okay, let's take a look at it. How many products do you sell? He said 1,000. I said, you have a little over 1,000 calls to generate your homepage. You see the scroll on the bottom that shows about 10 books? It's actually loading all 1,000 books in there. Take out 980 of those and just load your best sellers, and let's see what happens. It went down to 2 seconds. Reduce your number of calls. Don't have 1,000 calls to generate your homepage. 200 calls is even a lot. A lot of external calls. These are the type of things that are going to slow you down. Compress files. Images on a website shouldn't be more than 50 kilobytes, but I constantly see 500 kilobyte images. These are very big. Like I said, I have clients with 15 megabyte homepages. This is very, very large. Minify JS, the JavaScript, right? So remove the unnecessary spaces and tabs. It reduces the overall size of the files and makes your website go faster. These are the things you need to do. These are best practices. And the solution partners that do these every day, the ones I work with, the ones I talk on Skype all day long, these are the guys that excite me because I know together with what we're doing and what they're doing, this site and this merchant site's going to fly. And this is what gets me happy. This is what gets me to go into work every morning. And if I was just talking about how fast our hosting is every day, that we do that too, but I like working with a team. And all of us figuring out the way for the merchant to convert, right? It's all about conversion. We all do this for conversion. That's what we're doing this for. Combine or merge JavaScript and CSS. It's native in the Magento admin panel. Use it. It works tremendously. Like I said, load the CSS first and then the JavaScript last. That way your eye is looking at something, you're seeing it, and you're not having the blocking script of the JavaScript. Put it down at the bottom. Browser caching is important. 80% of a page is static objects a lot of the time. So if you have a visitor that comes back, a lot of times, if it's already sitting in their browser, they're going to load very quickly. Use CSS sprites. This is another one. It cuts the load time on the page. It's important. All of these are. And it really, really helps. Avoid redirects. I can't tell you how many clients I see that have a number of redirects. And basically, it's loading a blank page, and then you have to wait for it to go to the page you really want to see. So use cache very aggressively. Use RAM aggressively. All of the things we've talked about, all the things Cameron talked about, Memcache, Redis, APC, the Varnish, all reverse proxy cache, all of these things, HTTP accelerators, they're all going to make your site fly. And then we're all going to be happy. Use CDN, Content Delivery Network. We're agnostic. We have a partner, Max CDN, but we're agnostic. You want to use Akamai, Edgecast, Cloudflare, CloudFront. We like them all, but use one. You know, your static objects, it has a dual purpose. Cameron talked about it. One, you're getting all of the calls for the static objects are now going to the CDN. So it's allowing for a faster page load time, but it's also taking those calls off our servers, so it's increasing your concurrency on the servers. It's a win-win. Use it. Now a glimpse into the future. So those are a short kind of best practices. Most of you probably knew those, but it's important to point out. How many people in this room have heard of Hip Hop Virtual Machine? Anyone? Okay. The ones that don't? Came from Facebook. So Facebook, right? It was built in a dorm room in Harvard, guy sitting there coding, Mark Zuckerberg. Then everyone comes in, and they didn't redo that code. They just continue to hack that code, and the PHP gets larger and larger and larger. And they said, well, how can we make our PHP code for Facebook go faster? So they created something called Hip Hop Virtual Machine. And it's a PHP execution script. So it makes PHP go faster. We have a client, one of my favorite clients. I'm not sure if he's in the room, but David Gitman, he's right over there. When he calls me, I know I'm going to have some fun because he calls me and says, you know what, I'm trying to make my site go faster. I need some support from Zero Lag. I go, when and where? Because anything he wants to do to help make the site faster, I'll work with the dev, I'll work with anyone he wants. He brings in consultants. He's one of my favorite guys. He wanted to run HHVM and PHP FPM on the same production site to compare performance. But his question was, how do we do that? So what we came up with our engineers was a query parameter string, the one you see on the page right there. What does that look like? FPM, it's a normal URL. HHVM, normal URL, but adding the query parameter strings. And we set up some rules so that we knew which page they were going to, either the FPM page or the hip hop virtual machine page. How did it perform? The FPM page load time, 2.16 seconds. That's a pretty good load time, right? We changed nothing else except we swapped out FPM for HHVM. Any idea how it did? 1.14 seconds. The first day this was on, conversion increased on the site by 500%. Not bad, right? Facebook has seen throughput of 6 times normal PHP. Pretty impressive stuff. But the question is it ready for prime time? And it's not quite yet. We actually had to turn it off because the site was crashing 4 or 5 times a day. But they're working on it. And I can guarantee, David's over there, he will get it working because he won't stop until it's working. I know him. So it's currently deactivated. But he has a consultant, and I think Daniel is the consultant also in the back room. He's presenting here at some point, right? No, I thought you were. Talk to Danielo. He is the king of HHVM, and we can all work together. Well, that is all for me. To our cleanup hitter, Mr. Aaron Koch, who's our VP of Direct Sales.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. So what I'm here to talk about is, how does this impact you? How does performance impact your store? Where's the link? Where does the rubber meet the road? So studies show users are more likely to convert on faster pages. In fact, slow loading pages subconsciously reduce user confidence. So as users are clicking through their pages, the slower those pages load, the less and less confident that user is in the site. User experience is everything. And everyone really focuses quite a bit on the visual user experience, but there are actually 2 components. The visual user experience and then the invisible user experience, which is the experience of the passage of time itself. What we'd like to essentially bring to you is the idea that there's no silver bullet, that a combination of innovative front-end as well as performance-optimized infrastructure provides the best user experience. Magento is fast. Every day I hear people calling and telling us, hey, Magento is so slow, Magento is so slow. It's not. Magento is fast, and we've proven that. And having the right configuration, having the right combination of front end and back end will set your revenue on fire. The problem is that if you're not paying attention to these things, if you're not working with best practices like Doug mentioned, you will crash this very fast performance engine of an e-commerce platform into a tree. Consciously or not, visitors want pages to load in 2 seconds or less. And we know that a two-second page load time is very, very fast. So users may be a little bit unreasonable, but that's the reality. So a 1-second delay in page load time can reduce conversions by 7%. Let's take a look at how that works out in dollars. A site that does $100,000 a day in business can lose as much as $2.5 million annually for every extra second of page load delay. Let's say that one more time. $100,000 a day site can lose $2.5 million a year for every extra second of page load time. Essentially, small changes can have a huge impact on e-commerce sales. Let's take a look at bounce rate to page load time. As you see, as the time takes longer and longer, the page takes longer and longer to load, your bounce rate is going to increase precipitously. But everything below that line is lost opportunity. And so the idea is, how do we take everything that we know now, everything that we've been talking about and everything that you know, and utilize that to create more revenue, more conversions. Evaluate your site. Get some visibility into what you're doing. Doug talked a lot about number of calls to build the page, right? He talked about having your CSS first and then the JavaScript loading afterward. So how do you do that? We use a number of different free tools, one of which is webpagetest.org. It's a great tool. One of the things I really like about it is that it provides several scores, just grades, A to F. You either did great, not so good, or you failed. But it will give you some scores so you can get a general idea of how you're doing. It will provide scores for time to first byte, image compression, caching, CDN, a number of different things. We find it very useful. When Doug says he gets on the phone with a client and they say, my page is so slow, first thing he does is load up webpagetest.org, run the page through, and take a look at the waterfall. One of the other things I really like about it is that, on webpagetest.org, is that you can actually do a side-by-side comparison. So if you're working on a new version of a page and you have the original version of the page, you can actually load them side by side and see which one is loading faster, how, and why. Another tool we use quite a bit is GT Metrics. Great insight. Provides a breakdown of over 25 different page speed components. Bless you. As well as performance improvement recommendations. So provides a URL and a suggestion. Favorite thing about it is they provide Magento-specific recommendations. So relevant. They also include YSlow data, which is an open source performance analysis tool. What I'd like to impart to everyone here is to leave this room with a plan. Take everything that we've talked about and figure out how you can put it into action. Choose a hosting company that fits with your business. Not every hosting company is the best fit for every customer. That's the truth. And so what we recommend is talk to your hosting company, talk to the companies out there, figure out which of those companies is going to support you the way you need to be supported with your specific business. Implement a multi-layered approach. Like I said earlier, there is no magic bullet. No one thing will accelerate the site. No one thing will give you that performance optimization. It's about using multiple strategies, multiple tools, and a layered approach. Communicate with your hosting company. Doug was also talking about how it's really important for the hosting company and the developer and the customer to all talk to each other. This channel of communication is as important as anything else in the whole equation. That communication channel is what will make or break the project. And remember, your website is a tool. It is a business system designed to generate revenue. It is not a canvas. It's not a work of art. It is a business system designed to generate revenue. Thank you.